Gavin Menzies will be our guest. He's a former submarine pilot. Joined the Royal Navy, served in submarines from 1959 to 1970. But long before he joined the Royal Navy, he had spent a couple of years in China. He went back to China afterward, and he's been writing books ever since, and they're so interesting. And we'll talk about just how the Chinese contributed to Western culture in ways that you never knew. Perhaps you'd heard about 1421, the incredible true story of the discovery of America before Columbus. But now he's really blowing the lid off something, well, a whole, 300, 400-year portion of history, which had been completely miscredited until now. And we'll tell you this alternative view of the Renaissance in just a minute, what that really means for all of us. Next on Coast to Coast AM, this is Ian Punnett. I guess technically I should be calling you Captain Gavin Menzies.
Well, Ian, good morning. Thank you so much for inviting me to your show. I'm delighted to be here.
Well, what wonderful stuff to be working with this week, and I'm really excited about it. The whole Royal Navy submarine thing could be a whole program because I love subs, and I'm fascinated by all of the espionage you must have been involved with, all of the secret listening you must have been doing, all of the other things, all the top secret programs you must have been involved with in the Royal Navy in a submarine.
Well, Ian, I had the great pleasure and honor of coming to America several times. I served as operations officer in Resolution, which was our first Polaris submarine, and we came to Cape Canaveral and Charleston in the missile firing program. And the American submariners were incredibly kind and helpful in launching Britain's nuclear submarine program. So I'm indebted to all of the American submariners who made our lives so happy and comfortable.
Well, and submariners in general are kind of a, if you'll pardon the pun, kind of a subculture of all navies. I mean, even in World War II, right? I mean, submariners had a different feel for the enemy submariner, perhaps more than the average soldier might have felt on the battlefield toward the enemy.
Well, that's certainly true of submariners, yes. There was a great camaraderie, and there are all sorts of associations set up after the Second World War to promote understanding between different submarine forces. So you're quite right, yeah.
Because you were in such unique circumstances as a submariner, and that the only people who ever really know what that's like to be in a can under the water with a bunch of guys all sweaty and all the things that all the smells, the diesel fuel, I mean all that stuff that was so common to the submarine programs of World War II. The only other people that would have understood it were people who'd been in submarines, and it almost to be understood was more important than the nationalities, it would seem. So as soon as another enemy sub had been hit, it seemed like submariners had an empathy for the victims of another submarine that had been torpedoed more perhaps than a pilot might have had toward another pilot. Is that overstated?
No, I think that's absolutely right, Ian. We're known as the great unwashed chauffeurs, more or less worldwide. And for give an example, after the war, when the poor people in the Russian submarine Kursk, when that was sunk and they were all drowned, there was a huge amount of sympathy from submariners around the world. Quite a lot of money was raised for the families by submariners around the world. So what you said is absolutely right.
Yeah, that's quite a brotherhood. And of course, your work in the Navy must be very informative to the work you've done here in regard to the Chinese and how their exports, their intellectual exports around the world, changed Western history as we understand it, but not in a way that's been fully told until you started to write your two books, 1421, which is obviously still selling well, and the new New York Times bestseller, 1434, the year a magnificent Chinese fleet sailed to Italy and ignited the Renaissance.
Well, thank you, Ian. If I could illustrate what you've said by maps of the world, you see land from a submarine periscope differently to you see it above water, in that you're much lower down. And so, for example, if you look at a group of islands through a submarine periscope, it might appear a solid shoreline because you're not high enough up to see the breaks between the islands and the channels between the islands. All you see is a solid mass of land. And my quest started off really by being told that there was a map which showed islands in the Caribbean, which was published in 1424 and drawn in 1421. That's how my story really started. I was shown this by an American professor. And because I had really seen so much through a periscope, I was able to instantly realize that what was shown on this map, published 70 years before Columbus set sail, were the islands of Puerto Rico, Guadeloupe, and Les Santes. And they were very accurately drawn as seen from sea level. And therefore, I was able to say, this is now 10 years ago, I was able to say that somebody had drawn very accurately islands in the Caribbean 70 years before Columbus got there. And that's how my whole investigative saga started off.
Well, and here's the play as I see it, and tell me how you feel about this.
Yeah.
I'd love to talk for a little bit about 1434, digress back to 1421 and the book about how the Chinese discovered America, and then come back to 1434. That's kind of how I see it in my head. Are you willing to go there?
That's absolutely fine, Ian. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, then here's what I want you to do: set the table for people on how we traditionally understand the innovations of the Renaissance. How we, without bringing the Chinese into it at first, let's just talk about who is credited with developing or innovating what?
Well, the Renaissance took place in Florence. Started off in the late 1420s, early 1430s, and then it gathered pace for about 50 years, and it was an amazing explosion of new ideas. Suddenly, in this tiny Italian hill town, Florence, which was of negligible military importance, suddenly there was an explosion of ideas. For the first time, Florentine astronomers realized how the solar system worked. The Earth was not at the center of the universe. Until the 1430s, Europeans had thought that the Earth was the center of everything. The sun circled the Earth, and so did the planets. After 1434, the Florentine astronomers realized that the sun was the center of the universe and the Earth was just one planet amongst many, and the course of the Earth could be predicted mathematically. Now, this was of huge importance, because no longer was the Earth the center of everything. No longer was man, God's extraordinary creation, again, the center of the universe. So that was a massive change. At the same time, there were all sorts of improvements to perspective and how to draw and paint and sculpture. And this, again, was a revolutionary new style away from Gothic Europe. Now, the big question there's always been is how on earth did this knowledge, in all sorts of ways, making gunpowder weapons, new architecture, new sculpture, new methods of drawing, being able to make steel, being able to make ceramics, silk manufacture, a whole range of things. How on earth did this happen in this tiny little hill town, far away from anywhere, which was of negligible political or military importance, and was just one among many, many Italian hill towns? At the time, they didn't have their own currency, their own weights and measures, their own methods of measurement. They're all different. So that's the big question. Now, the answer until now has been, well, they did it because Rome was quite nearby, and the Florentines went to Rome and they studied Roman architecture, and they rediscovered the principles of Roman engineering, Roman drawing, Roman perspective, and so on. And they also rediscovered through Rome the ideals of Greece in philosophy and astronomy and so on. Now, that's the traditional history so far.
Well, now, and who are some of the marquee names from that the people would